Turkey is demonstratively disposing of the Russian S-400 systems, which it purchased back in 2017 for $2.5 billion. And all this is just to get an F-35 deal with America. The American publication Semaphore revealed that Trump's deal to sell F-35 fighter jets to Turkey was literally stalled for more than a month after he announced it publicly. There is only one reason: it's the Russian S-400 air defense systems, which Ankara is required to get rid of under American sanctions law. And here is what's important: the attempt to resell these systems to the United Arab Emirates apparently failed. The Emirates don't need these Russian systems either, and there are no more buyers for this scrap metal, which means there is only one option left on the table, which until recently seemed unthinkable: simply destroy and dispose of the S-400 systems, for which Turkey paid $2.5 billion. Literally cut them up for scrap metal. In this episode we'll talk not only about this, but also about how much Russian arms exports have collapsed during the full-scale war against Ukraine. My name is Alexei Pechi, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, give it a like and leave any comment under this episode after you finish watching the video. So Turkey is ready to destroy Russian S-400 systems in order to get a deal with the US for American F-35 fighter jets. American law directly requires Turkey to get rid of the Russian air defense system in exchange for access to the 6 F-35 aircraft, which Ankara has already paid for and which have just been sitting in America since 2019. After Turkey was excluded from this program. And now Recep Tayyip Erdogan wanted to outsmart the system a little and said, let's just turn off these S-400 systems. This is actually one of the important possible ways to solve the problem. But he risks angering American congressmen even more, who believe that the law requires a complete abandonment of the system, not just its deactivation. The second option is to sell the Russian air defense system to the United Arab Emirates, but according to sources, negotiations about this actually began last month. But apparently things haven't moved forward and the Emirates have also refused these systems. I'll explain why in a moment. Republican Senator Rick Scott stated Congress's position in extremely tough terms. Here's his quote: "I don't think they should have F-35s if they're not going to be a real partner. So if they have S-400s, they can't and won't have F-35s." Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch, who has long been blocking this deal with Turkey, spoke out. Here is his quote: "At the moment, they haven't removed the S-400s, so everything remains as it is." A source in the US administration confirmed that the sale to the Emirates is still possible, noting that, quote, "they have no problem buying all sorts of junk from the Russians," those are his exact words. But I should note that the Emirates most likely won't buy these systems either. The issue has already been resolved, they are refusing. I'll explain why a bit later. Now let me remind you where this whole story even came from, because without the background you can't understand the scale of the irony here. In 2017, almost 10 years ago, Turkey signed a contract with Russia for 4 battalions of the S-400, worth $2.5 billion. And the deliveries of these systems were completed in the summer and fall of 2019. Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself explained the reason for this deal very frankly. And he stated that if the US had sold Patriot systems to Turkey, he wouldn't have had to buy the Russian S-400s. So the main reason wasn't Ankara's sympathy for Russia, but supposedly Washington's refusal to provide its own NATO ally with an air defense system, which Turkey demanded to protect its border with Syria. When negotiations with the Americans stalled, Erdogan simply turned to an alternative supplier. At least that's how he described it. Washington's reaction was extremely harsh. In 2019, when it became clear that Erdogan's Turkey had received these systems and deployed them on its territory, Turkey was excluded from the joint F-35 production program with the memorandum signed in January 2007 being annulled. At that time, Ankara was obligated to purchase 100 F-35 aircraft. And in 2022, sanctions were added against the Turkish defense industry. When asked whether the deal with Russia was worth all this friction with the US, Erdogan responded without hesitation back in 2019. Quote, "I think it was worth it, but at that time Erdogan was confident." At that time, Turkey was offered F-16s instead, but Ankara refused, and now, 7 years later, it turns out that the very same S-400 Triumph, for which Erdogan sacrificed a place in the F-35 program, now has to be either sold for next to nothing or destroyed altogether. Well, as long as they can return to that same program, the one Erdogan traded for cooperation with the Russians. But I think, just like you, I'm intrigued by the question. Why can't they find a buyer for these S-400 systems at all? Well, you would think, no matter how you look at it, it's still a kind of weapon, anti-aircraft systems after all. Here statistics come to our aid. According to the latest report from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, published in March of this year, Russia's share of the global arms export market has plummeted from 21% during 2016 to 2020 to just 6.8% in 2021 to 2025. Russia became the only arms supplier among the top 10 in the world, whose arms exports during this period did not grow, but instead decreased by as much as 64%. The total arms exports from the European Union countries alone in 2021-2025 turned out to be 4 times higher than Russia's. At the same time, Russia's share in global arms imports was 0.4%, so it would seem that Russia is now buying something from someone, but less than it sells. Nevertheless, we see a situation where its arms exports have simply collapsed. Well, I should note that Russia is buying, for example, Iranian drones and North Korean artillery. Earlier data from the same institute show the trend even more clearly. According to calculations for 2021 to 2024, Russian arms exports have collapsed by 92%. Attention! From $14.5 billion in 2021 to less than $1 billion by the end of 2024. Just calculate how many times that is. More than 14 times the numbers have dropped. The main reason, according to the institute, the SIPRI Institute, is mainly related to Russia's decision to prioritize the production of weapons for its own army rather than for export. The effect of multilateral sanctions and the growing pressure from the US and its allies on those countries that were still buying Russian weapons. They started to put pressure so that they would avoid buying weapons from Russia. And even among the largest traditional buyers like India, purchases of Russian weapons were declining even before the full-scale invasion of the savage Russians into Ukraine, by the way, by 37% over the period from 2013 to 2022. As a result, we have quite a funny situation. 7 years ago, Turkey bought the S-400 Triumph air defense system from Russia, which no one else wants to buy. No one wants to take it from Turkey, even for a small price. And now this very system is blocking Turkey's access to the most modern Western fighter jets, which Erdogan personally agreed on with Trump at the last NATO summit. Selling the S-400 Triumph to the Emirates isn't working out, and now we've come to the most interesting part. Why don't the Emirates want to buy the S-400 either? Because they understand perfectly well that possessing the S-400 will automatically block them from buying their own F-35s. They understand that it's better not to get involved with this crap, otherwise the entire civilized world will simply turn its back on you. Of course, you can try to play both sides. But the Emirates don't want to buy the S-400. Well, the only one who formally has to approve, by the way, any resale of these systems to a third party is Moscow itself, and they have every reason to block this deal. It turns out that the disposal of the S-400 systems for which Ankara paid a huge amount of money and paid a reputational price in the form of 7 years of conflict with Washington, might turn out to be the only real way out of this deadlock. Simply because the weapon that Russia once proudly sold as a symbol of its own military superiority is not needed by anyone today. Well, including those who would like to get rid of it. I'm talking about Erdogan. In general, the story with the S-400 will most likely just end with it being scrapped for metal. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.